The encounter. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft, golden hue over the bustling suburban streets as the afternoon rush began. Kayla adjusted the straps of her backpack, its faded blue fabric worn with years of use, but still holding her most cherished belongings, school books, a few pens, a well-loved library book she had borrowed from the local library just that morning, and a small lunchbox packed with peanut butter and jelly, a reminder of the love her mother put into every detail of her day. The weight of her backpack didn't feel heavy, it was a comfort, a companion. The day had been uneventful. It was one of those routine afternoons where nothing particularly noteworthy occurred, save for the usual chatter in the hallways and the hum of teenage voices fading as school let out. Kayla was accustomed to the crowds that filled the streets after school, students from nearby schools either waiting for their parents or walking in groups to their homes. She was used to blending in, keeping to herself, her focus always on getting home, settling in, and doing her homework before dinner. But today, she felt an odd shift, a tension in the air that she couldn't quite place. It was a strange feeling, like something was going to happen, something that was far outside of her control. Her footsteps slowed slightly as she made her way down the sidewalk, unsure why she felt this sense of unease. She glanced around, noting the casual interactions between students, the distant chatter, and the faint hum of car engines as they passed. Everything seemed normal. But the officer, standing by his patrol car just off the sidewalk, wasn't just any officer. He stood a little too rigid, eyes scanning the crowd with a gaze that seemed to linger, almost like he was waiting for something to happen. She was half a block away when the officer's eyes locked onto hers. Something in that brief glance made her stomach twist, and she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. There was no reason for her to be afraid, not really. But something about his posture, his stance, made her feel as if she had become the focus of an unwanted spotlight. Before she could make a decision to change her path, to turn around, or to keep walking, he stepped forward. His stride was confident, deliberate, an officer of the law moving with purpose. But there was something off about his approach. Kayla's heart rate quickened. She had never been in trouble before, never had reason to think she would be stopped by the police. "Hey, you," the officer called out sharply, his voice slicing through the air like a knife. It was a command, not a request. Kayla's steps faltered as her heart skipped a beat. She stopped walking, turning her head slightly, but she didn't look up at him right away. She didn't know what to do. Her mind raced for an explanation. Had she done something wrong? Was he pulling her over for something trivial? Yes? Her voice came out quieter than she meant it to, as she finally lifted her eyes to meet his. The officer's gaze swept over her with a slow, calculating look, almost like he was assessing her in a way that made her uncomfortable. It wasn't the usual glance of a policeman ensuring safety, this felt invasive, as if she was being scrutinized for something more. "You," he repeated, as if she hadn't heard him the first time, "you're carrying a bag that doesn't belong to someone like you." The words hit her with a shock, a ripple of disbelief flashing across her face. She didn't understand what he meant by, "someone like you." Her mind raced to catch up. She was just a girl. She had done nothing wrong. She had walked this same path countless times, blending in with the other students. The officer's eyes narrowed as if he had seen through her thoughts. "What's inside that bag?" he asked, his voice low, though his tone was firm, commanding. Kayla's heart began to race. She wasn't sure how to respond. She didn't know why she was being singled out. Her throat went dry, but she forced herself to speak. It's just my school stuff. My lunch." "Really?" The officer's lips curled slightly into a half-smile, his words dripping with sarcasm. "I'd like to see for myself." Kayla's breath hitched. The officer had already taken a step closer, and his hand reached out toward her backpack. She instinctively pulled back, her fingers gripping the straps of the bag tighter. The weight of the backpack suddenly felt overwhelming, its contents now the center of her growing anxiety. She tried to take a step back, to maintain some space between them, but the officer wasn't giving her the chance. His eyes flashed as he grabbed the bag from her shoulder with a swift motion, jerking it away from her grip. The force made her stumble forward, but she quickly regained her balance, standing stock-still in shock. "Hey!" Kayla exclaimed, her voice rising higher than she intended, a mix of fear and confusion lacing her words. "Please, give it back. It's mine." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at the backpack in his hands, inspecting it with a strange satisfaction, as if he was about to uncover some great secret. The entire world seemed to slow down around her. The crowd of students, who had been murmuring to each other, fell silent as they turned their attention toward the scene unfolding in front of them. It wasn't the first time someone had been stopped by the police, but there was something about this moment that felt off, something that made her feel exposed, vulnerable, as if she was being punished for something she hadn't even done. He opened the zipper with a deliberate slowness, each movement more calculated than the last. His fingers rifled through the contents inside, pulling out her neatly organized binder, the tattered library book, and a small, zippered pouch of pens and pencils. He took his time inspecting each item, his face twisted in a mock expression of disappointment as if the very contents of her bag were somehow beneath him. "Look at this," the officer said aloud, holding up the library book like it was evidence of some great crime. "A book? A real page-turner, huh? You sure you're not hiding anything else in here?" Kayla stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. The humiliation burned through her like fire. The officer was treating her as though she were guilty of something, but there was nothing in her bag but the items of an ordinary student, books, pens, and a lunchbox. Yet here she was, standing in front of her peers, her belongings scattered on the ground in front of her, exposed to their judgment. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she fought them back. She wasn't about to cry in front of him. She wasn't going to show weakness. Not now. Not when this man seemed so intent on tearing her apart. She stepped forward, her voice breaking but still holding some semblance of strength. "Stop," she cried, her hands reaching for the scattered contents of her backpack. "Please. Just give me my things back." But the officer's expression darkened, and he blocked her path with his boot, pressing it down onto her notebook with a force that made her flinch. "Don't get smart with me," he sneered. "I'm doing my job. Someone reported a suspicious person. You should be thanking me for keeping everyone safe." Her chest tightened, and the sound of her heartbeat seemed to echo in her ears. The world around her was closing in, the weight of the crowd's eyes bearing down on her with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. She had never felt smaller in her life. She had never been more exposed. Her fingers clenched into fists at her sides, not out of anger, but out of helplessness. She wanted to scream, to shout at him, to make him understand that she hadn't done anything wrong. But something told her that this officer wasn't listening. He wasn't interested in fairness, in justice. He was interested in control, in making her feel small, in making an example out of her for no reason other than his own sense of superiority. Her mind raced, searching for an escape, but none came. She was trapped. There was nowhere to go. The crowd of students had grown larger, their whispers growing louder, turning into murmurs of disbelief. Some were laughing nervously, unsure of what to say. Others stood in stunned silence, their faces a mix of confusion and discomfort. No one stepped forward to intervene, not even the teachers who had been passing by just moments before. Kayla felt the tears threatening to spill from her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not let this man see her broken. But then, from the edge of the crowd, a familiar voice broke through the tension. "Kayla." It was her father's voice. His tone was steady, calm, but there was something in it that made Kayla's heart leap with relief. She turned toward him, seeing him emerge from the crowd, his long stride quickening as he made his way toward her. The officer, sensing the shift, looked up, his eyes widening for just a moment before he quickly tried to regain his composure. Her father, Judge Samuel Mitchell, was a man of principle. His presence was commanding, and there was a sense of authority about him that made even the most hardened individuals think twice. Today, that authority was about to bring an end to this injustice. "Officer," her father said, his voice clear and unwavering. "What's going on here?" The officer straightened, clearly uneasy now that the situation had taken a turn. But Kayla's father wasn't about to let him hide behind false pretenses. "Explain to me why my daughter's personal belongings are being rifled through and discarded like garbage." The officer hesitated, but there was no avoiding the confrontation now. The confrontation. Kayla's heart raced as she watched her father approach. His steps were firm and purposeful, each one carrying the weight of authority. Judge Samuel Mitchell had spent years in the courtroom, earning a reputation for being a fair, no-nonsense figure who never backed down from a fight when it came to justice. Yet in this moment, as he stood before her, his daughter, she saw a different side of him, the side that only appeared when it mattered most. A side that would protect her, no matter the cost. The officer, clearly rattled by her father's arrival, stiffened as he straightened his uniform. His previous arrogance faltered for just a fraction of a second. It was enough. Kayla saw the shift, the tension in the air that wasn't just about the moment they were in but about the power that her father wielded. "Officer," her father repeated, his voice calm but edged with authority. "Explain to me, right now, why you're accosting my daughter in this manner." The officer's mouth opened and closed several times, as though searching for the right words. But nothing came out immediately. He glanced at Kayla, then back at her father, clearly realizing he was no longer in control of the situation. "Sir," the officer said, his voice faltering a little, "I'm just doing my job. We received a report of suspicious activity around here. I had reason to question her belongings." "A report," her father repeated slowly, his gaze sharp. "And what was the report based on? A hunch? A stereotype? Or was there actual cause to pull my daughter aside like this?" The officer hesitated again, his eyes darting nervously to the gathered crowd of onlookers. Kayla could feel the weight of their collective gaze, some of them still uncertain whether they should speak up or just stand back. It seemed that no one had expected this to escalate the way it had, and now, everyone was waiting for something to happen. The officer's bravado was slipping away with each passing second. She looked suspicious," the officer muttered, barely above a whisper. "She was walking with a bag that wasn't appropriate for her age. I had to check it." Kayla's breath caught in her throat. Suspicious? For what? For being a black teenager with a backpack? For being a student trying to get home? "Is this how you treat all teenagers, officer?" her father pressed, his voice still cool, though his jaw clenched with barely contained anger. "What exactly made her look suspicious to you? Was it her appearance? Her age? Or was it simply the color of her skin?" The officer's face flushed a deep shade of red as he stammered, trying to backpedal from the accusation. But her father wasn't about to let him off the hook so easily. Judge Mitchell was a man who didn't tolerate injustice, not when it was happening to his daughter, not when it was happening in front of him, and certainly not when it was based on nothing more than racial profiling. I didn't mean it like that," the officer stuttered, his defensive posture now clearly crumbling. I don't know. I thought, it seemed like there was something off." Kayla wanted to scream. She wanted to tell the officer how wrong he was, how hurtful his words were, how unjust this whole situation was. But instead, she remained silent, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the back and forth unfold. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about a system that had treated her like she didn't matter, like she was less than everyone else simply because of who she was. Her father didn't flinch. He stepped closer to the officer, his voice lowering but carrying an undeniable weight. "You don't get to make people feel less than human just because of your prejudices. You don't get to harass a child, my child, because of your assumptions." The officer swallowed hard, now clearly uncomfortable under the intense scrutiny of both Judge Mitchell and the growing crowd of witnesses. His hand tightened around the straps of Kayla's backpack, still held in his grip. It was a symbol now, a physical manifestation of his power over her, and he didn't know how to let go. He had made a mistake. A big one. And deep down, he knew it. Kayla's father turned to the crowd that had gathered, his eyes sweeping over the onlookers. The murmurs had died down, replaced by an eerie stillness. The students, teachers, and parents who had been walking by were now all watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Some looked guilty for not stepping in sooner, while others seemed afraid to speak up. But her father wasn't about to let this moment slip away. He wasn't going to let the officer hide behind his uniform and continue his injustice. "You've all seen what's happening here, haven't you?" Judge Mitchell said, his voice booming now as he addressed the crowd directly. "You've seen how this officer has treated my daughter, how he's treated a young girl who has done nothing wrong except exist in a world that still judges her by the color of her skin." There was a collective pause. No one said anything, but the atmosphere had shifted. The officer stiffened even more, as if the realization had finally dawned on him that his actions had been witnessed by more people than he had anticipated. Kayla's father turned his attention back to the officer, his voice sharp. "I suggest you release my daughter's belongings immediately. You're not above the law, and neither is anyone else. If you don't, I'll be forced to file a formal complaint, and trust me, it won't be the first time you've had to explain your behavior." The officer faltered again, glancing nervously at the crowd, at Kayla's father, and at the girl who had been the target of his cruelty. His grip loosened, and slowly, with great reluctance, he released the backpack, allowing it to fall back into Kayla's hands. She took it, her fingers brushing against the worn fabric as if it were a lifeline, something to steady her in this moment of chaos. Judge Mitchell didn't look at his daughter right away. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on the officer, his expression one of disgust. "I suggest you rethink how you interact with people in the future, officer. Because if you think this kind of behavior is acceptable, then you're in the wrong profession." For a moment, it felt as though the officer might try to argue, to challenge him. But he didn't. Instead, he muttered something under his breath, his shoulders slumping as he turned and made his way back to his patrol car. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of his wrongdoing. He simply left. Kayla stood there, holding her backpack in her hands, still trembling with the rush of emotions flooding her system. But as the officer walked away, her father turned to her, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though her voice wavered slightly as she spoke. I think so, Dad. I don't know why he did that. It doesn't make sense." Her father placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It doesn't make sense, sweetheart. But what matters is that you're safe now. And we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. No one has the right to treat you like that. Not ever." Kayla swallowed hard, trying to fight back the tears that threatened to spill. Her father had always been her protector, but today, in front of everyone, he had done more than that. He had shown the world what it meant to stand up against injustice, to call out racism when it reared its ugly head. She had always admired him, but today, she felt an even deeper sense of pride. Her father was a force to be reckoned with. And she was proud to be his daughter. The crowd began to disperse slowly, some people still murmuring to each other, others walking away as if nothing had happened. But Kayla didn't care about them. She cared about what her father had just done, what they had just done together. They had stood up for what was right. As the last of the bystanders faded into the distance, Kayla's father gave her a gentle smile. "Let's get you home, kiddo." Kayla nodded, the weight of the world still on her shoulders but somehow lighter now. She wasn't alone anymore. She had her father, her protector, her advocate. And no matter what, she knew she would never be made to feel small again. The aftermath. The ride home was quiet, almost too quiet. Kayla sat in the passenger seat of the family car, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. The hum of the engine and the occasional squeal of the tires on the road were the only sounds breaking the silence between her and her father. Her mind replayed the encounter with the officer over and over again, each detail echoing in her thoughts: the officer's mocking tone, the way he'd held her backpack as if it were a weapon, and the feeling of utter helplessness as she had stood there, humiliated, unable to do anything except take it. It was hard to understand why something so ordinary, just walking home from school, had turned into an ordeal like that. What was so wrong with her that made the officer think she deserved that treatment? What had she done to deserve it? Kayla's father, Judge Samuel Mitchell, kept his eyes on the road, but every so often, he would glance over at her, his brow furrowed in thought. He could see the weight of the situation in her expression. This wasn't just about what had happened that afternoon, it was about everything that had come before it. It was about the long history of discrimination, of people like his daughter being treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. As a father, it tore him apart to know that his child would grow up in a world that still allowed these injustices to occur. But as a judge, it also fueled his resolve to do everything in his power to fight for change. When they pulled into their driveway, Kayla still hadn't said a word. She was lost in thought, her gaze distant as she stared out the window. The car came to a stop, and her father turned off the engine. He sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel, gathering his thoughts. "Kayla," he finally said, his voice soft but steady. "We need to talk about what happened. I know it's a lot to process, but I want you to understand something very important. This isn't your fault. None of it." Kayla blinked, the words breaking through her fog of confusion. She turned to face him, her eyes red from the tears she had tried so hard to hold back. "But, Dad, I didn't do anything wrong. I was just walking home, with my stuff, and he treated me like I was a criminal." Her father nodded, his jaw tightening as he spoke. "I know. And that's the part that hurts the most, doesn't it? That you didn't deserve any of that. You did nothing wrong. But this happens. It happens to people who look like you, and that's something we can't ignore. But I want you to know this, just because something is wrong doesn't mean it's your fault. It doesn't mean it's a reflection of who you are." Kayla swallowed, her voice small. "But why? Why me? Why did he single me out?" Her father's eyes softened, and he reached over to gently touch her hand. "I wish I had an answer that made sense, baby. I really do. But the truth is, there's a history behind this. People like that officer make assumptions based on prejudice, on things they've been taught, things they've learned over time. They see someone who looks different from them and they make a snap judgment. It's not right, and it shouldn't happen. But it does. And when it does, it's up to us to fight back. Not just for you, but for everyone who faces this kind of treatment." Kayla looked out the window again, her mind swirling with the complexity of what her father was saying. She had always known that racism existed in the world, had seen it in the news, heard about it in her history classes, felt it in the whispers when her family walked into certain stores. But she had never thought it would touch her directly, not like this, not so blatantly. It made her wonder how many times it happened to other kids who didn't have a father like hers, a judge who would stand up for them, who would make sure they weren't ignored or belittled. "Do you think he would have done that to someone else?" Kayla asked quietly, her voice thick with uncertainty. "Someone who wasn't, someone who didn't look like me?" Her father sighed deeply. "I don't want to say yes, but in my heart, I know the answer." "You know it too, don't you?" Kayla nodded slowly, a knot tightening in her chest. "Yeah. It's not right, Kayla," her father said, his tone firm. "But what we can do is fight. We can call it out when we see it. We can make sure that people understand that this kind of behavior is unacceptable. And we can work toward making the world better for the next generation." She glanced up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time since they had arrived home. There was something in his eyes, something fierce and unwavering, that made her believe in what he was saying, even if she didn't yet know how to make it happen. How do we do that? How do we stop it from happening to anyone else? Her father took a deep breath, his expression thoughtful. One step at a time. We start by speaking out. We start by not letting moments like today slide by unnoticed. And we start by teaching others, teaching people that everyone deserves respect, regardless of their skin color, their background, or their circumstances. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But it starts with us. It starts with people like you and me, standing up for what's right. Kayla nodded slowly, her resolve growing. I want to do something. I don't want this to happen to anyone else, ever again. Her father's smile was small but genuine. You're already doing something, Kayla. You're already making a difference by standing up for yourself. And that's where it all starts. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. Kayla couldn't shake the image of the officer's face from her mind. She couldn't forget how helpless she had felt, how small she had been made to feel in that moment. But she also couldn't forget her father's words. He had been so sure, so confident in his belief that they could make a difference. And she found herself clinging to that belief, even when it felt like the world was working against her. At school, Kayla found herself becoming more aware of the way she was treated by both students and teachers. There were whispers, some sympathetic, others curious, as her classmates seemed to discuss what had happened. She couldn't escape the feeling that they were all waiting for her to be angry, to lash out. But all she felt was a mixture of sadness and determination. She wasn't angry at the officer anymore, not just at him, anyway. She was angry at a system that allowed people to think that they could treat others this way. Angry that her friends, her peers, would have to face the same thing one day, maybe even the same people. Her father had told her that she was making a difference just by standing up for herself. But Kayla wanted to do more. She wanted to stand up for others, to speak out for everyone who had been silenced by fear and injustice. And so, with her father's guidance, she made a promise to herself: this wouldn't be the last time she stood up. It would be the first step in a journey toward something bigger. She didn't know what that looked like yet, but she was determined to find out. When she walked into school the next day, something had shifted. It wasn't just about what had happened to her anymore. It was about what she could do now. And in her heart, Kayla knew that the fight for justice wasn't over, it was just beginning, standing strong. The days that followed her conversation with her father marked the beginning of a new chapter for Kayla Mitchell. It wasn't just about the injustice she had faced anymore, it was about the bigger picture. It was about standing up, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, humiliated, or discriminated against. Kayla had always been quiet, the kind of person who would rather blend in than draw attention to herself. But now, there was a fire burning inside her that refused to be ignored. At school, the whispers about her encounter with the officer didn't stop. But instead of letting it make her shrink further into the shadows, Kayla started to take control. She found herself speaking up in class discussions, no longer afraid to share her opinions or ask difficult questions. She refused to let the weight of what had happened to her become a reason to cower. In fact, it became her motivation, her driving force to speak out and demand change in ways she hadn't thought possible before. The first step was in her English class. They had been reading To Kill a Mockingbird, and Kayla found herself almost unable to focus on the page, her thoughts constantly returning to the officer's sneer, the way he had belittled her in front of her classmates. She couldn't let it go. And then, when the teacher asked the class to discuss the themes of racism in the novel, Kayla spoke up. I think, she started, her voice quiet at first but growing stronger with each word, that sometimes we forget how easily people can be judged just by how they look. In the book, Scout learns about injustice, about how people who are different are treated unfairly. But it's not just a story. It's real. Every day, people are treated differently because of the color of their skin. And it happens right here, in our school, in our town." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the class was silent. Kayla could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, some curious, others unsure of what to say. But she pushed on. "It happened to me last week," she continued, her voice gaining confidence. "A cop treated me like a criminal just because I'm black. He didn't know anything about me. He didn't know who I was, what I've done, or what I'm capable of. But he assumed the worst. And it hurt. But I'm not going to let that be the end of the story. I'm going to stand up and make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Her teacher, Mrs. Thompson, looked at her with a mixture of surprise and respect. It wasn't often that Kayla spoke out like this, especially about something so personal. But in that moment, Mrs. Thompson saw the spark in her students' eyes, a spark that was impossible to ignore. "Kayla," she said gently, "thank you for sharing that. It takes a lot of courage to speak up, especially about something so painful. I think what you said is incredibly important, and I hope we can all reflect on that." The rest of the class sat in stunned silence for a few more moments, but the conversation had changed. Instead of ignoring the issue, they were talking about it, discussing the ways in which racism still pervaded their society, and how they could change it. The words of one student had sparked a shift, and Kayla felt a sense of power in that moment. For the first time, she realized that speaking up didn't just make her a target. It made her a voice for change. That afternoon, when Kayla walked home from school, she felt different. She wasn't weighed down by the humiliation she had felt earlier in the week. Instead, she felt lighter, freer. It was as if a burden had been lifted from her shoulders. The officer's words, his sneers, still stung, but they no longer had the power to break her. She was standing stronger than ever before, not just for herself, but for others who couldn't speak up. As she neared her house, she saw a familiar figure standing at the end of the driveway. Her father was waiting for her, a warm smile on his face. He had always been there for her, through every struggle, every challenge, and today, she could see the pride in his eyes. "Hey, kiddo," he greeted, opening the door as she approached. "How was school today?" Kayla gave him a small smile, feeling the weight of the day settle into her chest. "It was good. Actually, it was really good." She paused, looking up at him. "I spoke up in class. About what happened with the cop. And it felt powerful." Judge Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And how did that go?" Kayla took a deep breath. "I think it went well. We talked about racism and how it still happens. And I told them how I felt, how it hurt. I think they listened. At least, I hope they did." Her father nodded, his expression softening. "I'm proud of you, Kayla. It's not easy to speak out, especially when it's about something so personal. But that's how change starts, one person at a time, one voice at a time." Kayla looked down at her feet for a moment, her hands twisting together nervously. I don't want to stop. I want to keep going, keep speaking out. I don't want this to be just a one-time thing. I don't want anyone else to feel the way I did. To feel powerless." Her father's voice was filled with resolve. "And you won't, Kayla. You won't be powerless. You've already taken the first step. And now you're showing others how to do the same." Over the next few weeks, Kayla did exactly what she had set out to do. She became a voice for others. She spoke out in class when injustice was discussed, she stood up for her friends when they faced discrimination, and she worked with her father to learn more about how the legal system could help combat racial profiling and police brutality. She started organizing small community meetings, inviting her peers and their parents to come together and discuss how they could make a difference. It wasn't easy. There were moments when people doubted her, when she felt like giving up. But she never did. Because every time she saw the fear in someone else's eyes, the same fear she had seen in her own heart. She knew she couldn't stop. And then one day, the phone call came. It was from the local community center, the one that had been supporting her efforts all along. They wanted her to come speak at a rally, to share her story, to talk about the need for change in the community. Kayla's heart raced when she heard the request. She had never done anything like this before. She had never spoken in front of a crowd of strangers, let alone an audience that would expect her to say something powerful, something that could make a real difference. But as her father had taught her, it wasn't about being perfect, it was about speaking your truth. That night, Kayla stood in front of a crowd of hundreds, her hands shaking at her sides, her heart pounding in her chest. But when she opened her mouth, the words came out steady and strong. "I'm just a 15-year-old girl," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "But I've learned that sometimes, that's enough to make a difference. I've learned that standing up for yourself, for what's right, is the first step toward changing the world. I've learned that even though I'm scared, even though it hurts, I have a voice. And I'm going to use it. For me. For you. For all of us." As the crowd erupted into applause, Kayla knew she had found her purpose. And it wasn't just about fighting back. It was about creating a world where no one else would have to face the same pain she had. And she was ready.